In history and in history of science as well, contingency is often the key to understand the events. And it is from a naturalistic contingency that I wish to start my presentation. In the vast class of cartilaginous fishes, or chondrichthyes, the great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias, is the bigger, most famous, and most ferocious predator. White sharks are extremely moving and fast animals, which typically prefer oceans to inner seas, as the Mediterranean, for example. And even if it's not so uncommon to find it in the Mediterranean, it can be presumed that when some fishermen capture one far from the seashore of Leghorn in Tuscany in October 1666, the fact aroused marvel among the spectators. What's sure is that this event intrigued the famous patron of arts and sciences as the Grand Duke Ferdinando II de' Medici, who gave order immediately to bring the head of this monster to Florence so that it could be studied by the greatest anatomist of Tuscany, the Danish Niels Stinsen or Nicolaus Steno. From the very careful study of the anatomy of the head of this monster, of the shark, Steno published what would have been one of the best anatomical treatises in the history of science in the 17th century, which was the Elementorum Myologiae Specimen, Seu Musculi Descriptio, Geometrica, Quaecidum Canis Carcari, etc. But what's interesting to us for now is that there's a very specific part of this anatomical treatises which is devoted to the study of the teeth of the shark. And Steno noticed that these teeth were strikingly similar to the fossil teeth that were found in the rock layers and rock strata on many Mediterranean islands and Sicily and Malta. Steno went over focusing on this topic in the next treatises, De Solido Intrasolidum, in 1669, where not only he argued that the resemblance of the teeth of this shark with the fossil teeth made him presume that these teeth had an organic origin. But also he noticed that from the disposition in the rock layers, in the rock strata of these teeth and in general of this fossil, it could be presumed an art, a real chronology out of them. Well, Steno's works are a crucial passage in the application of scientific method to the study of the earth sciences. In his writings, many historians have detected the oldest establishment of the law of superposition, the foundational principle of sedimentary stratigraphy, which states that in sedimentary strata, the lower ones are more ancient than the upper ones. It seems to us obvious, but for that time it wasn't so. Anyway, the question of fossil did not begin with Steno, even if, as an introduction, at this time, many other naturalists coming from many scientific and philosophical background tried to deal with the mysterious problem of the origin of these fossilia. Even if the typical approach in 16th century was an encyclopedic approach, as it happened in Konrad Gessner in his De Omni Rerum Fossilium Genere 1565, as it happens in Georg Agricola, the father of mining, in De Natura Fossilium in 1546, and it happens, moreover, in Ulisse Aldrovandi in his Museum Metallicum 1648. Anyway, it's not said, and it's not true, that this encyclopedical approach had not a clear effect on the development of science. A clear effect, and the most practical effect, was the institution of the Wunderkammern, which were this encyclopedic collection of objects whose categorical boundaries were not well defined and which could include objects belonging to the natural history, art, archaeology, antiquities, etc. But the effect of the vast collections of this great ensemble of things from the most disparate origins brought to a deeper study and a deeper knowledge of these objects, and brought to a development of what could be considered as the knowledge of scientific experimental research. And moreover, yet in the 16th century, we have others as Bernard Palissy, 5010, 5019, which is in Discours admirable in 1518, stated and supported the organic origin of fossils, arguing, moreover, that the Earth was more old and older than what was stated by the Bible. And yet in Italy, in Verona, Girolamo Fracastoro, in his treatises, famous medicines, in his treatise Homocentrica, 1538, supported the organic origin of fossils and argued, moreover, that the rock layers were the result of multiple immersions and sequences of sediment depositions, clearly contradicting the theory and the statement and the history of the biblical deluge. But then we have another treatise, some decades later, which is Fabio Colonna, the Colosso Petris Dissertatio, on the fossil teeth of sharks. Colonna has a clear experimental approach toward the study of these teeth, but at the same time, he recognized the organic origin of this fossil, but refuses to confront with a chronological problem. And the only statement we can find of Colonna about the Bible is this allusion in which he says that the sea once covered all the mountains, and that they were inhabited by once living man is attested not only by the Holy Scripture, but among the others also by Aristotle and other philosophers, historians and others, which affirmed the same things. So in the 16th century we have people saying, and clearly saying, that Bible was not right, and that the earth was much older than the Bible stated. In 17th century, we have people, especially in Italy, saying that, or refusing to confront with this problem. Why? What happened? It happened a bunch of things. It happened the Protestant Reformation. It happened the Counter-Reformation. It happened the Council of Trent, from Paul III, 1545, to Pius I, to 1563, the Catholic reaction to Protestant Reformation, and with it, the Inquisition, and the institution of the Sacred Congregation of the Index, created in 1571 by Pope Pius V. And the most strikingly cultural consequence of this politics was the institution of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the indexes of the forbidden books, with three main versions. The first one, the Index Paulinum, promulgated by Paul IV in 1559, the Index Tridentinum by Pius IV in 1564, and the Index Clementinum by Clement VIII, the most hard and severe of all, in 1596. And as a direct consequence of this politics, the Hermetic and Neoplatonic doctrines and the doctrine of double truth, the belief that the religion and philosophy might arrive at contradictory truth without mutual detriment, were no more or far less tolerated. And the more dramatic consequences of this politics were the arrest in the 1592 and the execution at the stake in 1600 of Giordano Bruno, and of course the most famous of all, in 1633, Galileo, who was forced to recant his defense of heliocentric system and spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. And we have also a political and warfare consequence, the bloodiest and deadliest conflict that scourged Europe before the World War I, the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1645. And as a consequence of this terrible conflict, we have a splitted Europe in which the religious, ideological, political, and somehow philosophical fractures that in those years tormented the continent could not avoid affecting a thorny issue like the debate on fossil and on diluvialism. Yet it is undisputed that even in this critical situation, this lively discussion and reciprocal influences between Anglican, Catholic, and Reformed scholars were far from rare, and frequently this context bore fruitful results. Anyway, it is undoubted that we had a more pressure in the Catholic countries than in Protestant ones. And the first Protestant countries who abolished the limitation to abolish the censorship, if we may say so, was England indeed. With in 1694, the abolition of the licensing order, even as a consequence, of John Milton's Areopagitica, a pamphlet who had a great effect on the public opinion. And which was the Catholic context? The Catholic context was a mess, in the meaning that we have Spain, and many times the indexes, Librorum Prohibitorum, were not the result of religious purposes or religious causes, but responded to political purposes. And so we have many Catholic countries. We had, for example, France, or beyond Portugal, beyond Spain. We have their own indexes of the forbidden books. And in many cases, the forbidden books were not the books that were forbidden for being heretical, but for being simply against the king or against the political power. Okay, and so we can say that just the only country in which the censorship of the real church, of the Roman Church, was effective was, with many exceptions, Italy. And in Italy too, we have a lot of exceptions, as for example, in the liberal Venice, where, just to make a clear, very striking example, Felice Peretti, that would become Pope Sixtus V, from 1585 to 1590, was sent to Venice as chief inquisitor. So an inquisitor who had the typical duty to control all the publication and the heretical publication, to denounce them to the central power of Rome. Well, but such was his fervor and his severity that the Venetian Republic asked for his removal to the Pope. And this was granted only in 1560 by Pope Pius IV, who, not by chance, wanted to keep a good relationship with all the Catholic states in order to contrast the spread of Protestantism in Europe. Expedience was, one more time, was more important than religion. As a consequence, anyway, and this is no doubt, of the Catholic censorship, in Italian science, and especially during the 17th and 18th century, description prevails over interpretation. I wish this would be a real clear point. Description prevails over interpretation in Italian science. This is a typical trait of authors like Ramazzini, Stino, Scilla, Colonna, Torricelli, Malpighi, Vallisneri, and many, many others. The experimental data are hard facts, and therefore they are undeniable. The interpretative side is much more dangerous for Catholic authors, and much more than the heterodoxy of scientific theories, which is not tolerated in any case, is the explicit claim to independence from the doctrine of the Church. I recognize and acknowledge this is a small difference, but it is really far from unimportant. Rather, this tight passage often allows Catholic authors to express almost heretical or unorthodox theories, although at the price of a great, sometimes of a very great, expressive ambiguity, of course. But let's shift the attention to England, where we have another problem, and the problem is related to rocks. A major role in the formulation of theories was played by the age of the rocks, in fact, others had to deal with. The fossils studied by Ramazzini, Scilla, Colonna, Stino, Vallisneri, as we'll see, came from the late Cenozoic or Quaternary strata, not older, therefore, than 5 million years ago, and therefore resemble present-day organisms more than did the English fossils, found in Mesozoic or Paleozoic strata, older than 65 million years ago. Just for a striking example is the famous ammonites, okay? Thus, British researchers such as Woodward, Hooker, Lister, Ray, and many others had different problems to solve in developing their theories compared with Italian naturalists. And we have almost, if we can simplify the situation in England, we have two parties. The party that recognizes and acknowledges the organic origin of these strange fossils, and the other parties who say these are too strange. for us to acknowledge their organic origin. And of the first party, the most famous one and the most learned and skilled one was undoubtedly Robert Hooke, which in his Lectiones Cluteriane, in his posthumous work in 1705, declared the organic origin of all these fossils. Robert Hooke, polymath, proud member of the Royal Society, inventor, microscopist, astronomer, colleague and the greatest rival of Newton, Hooke showed all his skills in his chronological interpretation of fossils and of sedimentary layers. And with respect to this topic, his most important writings refer to a series of lectures, the Lectiones Cutleriane, in fact, that were later published in 1705 in his posthumous works. These works are not only based on a strikingly clear and skilled experimental research, they are also accompanied by strikingly fine images. Images a real important role in the war for diluvialism and for the recognition of organic origin of fossils. And just a few quotations just to show you how was skilled Hooke in perceiving the chronological factor who was inner in this own not resemblance of these ammonites with the younger fossils. Most part of the surface of the earth had been since the creation changed in its position and height in respect to the sea, to wit many parts of which are now dry land and lie above the sea, have been in former ages covered with it. Now, Hooke thinks that it is probably this strangeness, the strange shape of this fossil, to make us think that these fossils are very, very old. He has an intuition of the chronological dimension, but this is a dangerous start, not only for the censorship problem, but also from a philosophical point of view, and we'll see. In fact, not all people thought as Hooke. As the great naturalist Martin Lister, who both in his Historia Animalium 1678 and Historia Conchiliorum 1675, he described in distinct chapters the British fossil shells, and he denied their organic origin. But it is extremely significant that Lister agreed with Steno on the animal origin of the glossopetre, because they were very similar to present-day animals, and in general of other Mediterranean fossils. Lister's opinion that English shells were lapides sui generis, who is a Latin term for meaning rocks on their own kind, allowed him to bypass the philosophical problem of the morphological difference from living organisms. However, this position implied another philosophical dilemma. Since if these fossils were lusi naturae, jokes of nature, product of the case, jokes of nature, it was necessary to admit the existence of objects with no function or no purpose. And this was an unbearable assumption in a world like the world of 17th and 18th century, where God and nature did nothing in vain, and where the Leibnizian principle of sufficient reason was the dominant theory. Of the same position was Robert Plot in his very learned and very well illustrated History of Oxfordshire. He stated, upon mature deliberation, I must confess that I'm inclined rather to the opinion of Mr. Lister that they, the fossils, are lapides sui generis than to theirs, Hooke's and Ray's theories. As we see, Ray's was the opinion of Hooke, even if slightly different. And they are thus formed in animal mold. The latter opinion apparent at present to be pressed with far more and more insuperable difficulties than the former. And we find another statement from Plot, which is very significant because Plot has the total freedom to state that the flood in the days of Noah, and of very good reasons too, seems not to have been universal, and they must to have covered only the continent of Asia, and not to have extended itself to this then uninhabited western part of the world. This opinion was declared heretic in Italy, so it wasn't allowed. So people and scholars who had to declare this opinion had to gloss over it using a series of rhetorical expediences that we will see more in detail later, if you will not be bored. John Ray, in his miscellaneous discourses concerning the dissolution and changes of the world, he cautiously stated that the organic theory for all fossils was the best one, as the acknowledgement of lusi naturae, jokes of nature, could pave the way to the impious advocates of case and atheism. At the same time, anyway, Ray refused the concept of extinction to avoid discontinuity in the completeness of the world creation. Therefore, he assumed that all these strange organisms, ammonites, for example, still existed in the many parts of the earth, that all the oceans that had not been explored yet. Let's remember they were in the 17th century, and still today there are many parts of the ocean that have not been explored yet. Anyway, all these theories led to what can be considered, with many and very significant exceptions, the main theory of the Earth of those years, was diluvialism. The tendency to consider fossil remains and geological structures a clear effect of the biblical flood, which is conventionally referred to as diluvialism, assembled various and often contrasting theories. Not a few authors try to explain how the deluge happened in order to reconcile fossil evidence with a biblical perspective. In many cases, these efforts involved non-restrictive principles of interpretation of the holy text, with a special regard for those issues not directly pertaining to the doctrinal matters. The acceptance of the flood as a historical fact initially seemed to be a common feature of many scholars, both in Catholic and Protestant Europe. Nevertheless, much controversy arose over the modality of God's direct action of natural laws. Miracle against a flood which was a deep part, an integrated part of the natural processes. God's might was used to explain a wide, extremely heterogeneous array of catastrophic events. And in many cases, the authors loaded each other with reciprocal invective, the most common of which included ignominious words as incoherence, arrogance, atheism, or heresy. But more the other things, I want to point your attention on another aspect of this war, because it was a war. A war that was fought between a Catholic and Protestant side, also with the use of the image and the allegorical image. And if we could choose, should we be forced to choose two images that embody and this maximum power and significance, the two different opinions that were in those times, we should choose the Telluris Theoria Sacra of Thomas Burnet from the Protestant side, and the Vana Speculazione Disingannata dal Senso of Agostino Scilla, a Sicilian painter and naturalist. La Vana Speculazione Disingannata dal Senso. Here's the allegory. As I told you, Italian scholars tend to focus on the experimentalism. Okay? Interpretation is dangerous. And this will be the cause of a problem, because interpretation is just the other side of the coin of experimentalism in order to make science go further and proceed. But for now, let's focus on the frontispiece of the vain speculation. La vana speculazione disingannata dal senso means the vain speculation undeceived by sense, where sense means solid experience, okay? And we have the embodiment of the vain speculation, which is this cloudy figure, okay, with unbelieving or very perplexed eyes, is observing Akin, which is showed it by the sense, with his feet well planted on the earth, and the other hand pointing at the fossils in the rocks. Okay, Scilla is a proud defender of the organic origin of all the fossils. I'm well aware that the corals, the shells, the teeth of Lamia are real corals, real shells, real teeth and bones. And although they are petrified, they are not made of stone. The own composition of the strata imperatively persuades me of this, and it seems to me impossible that truth could be achieved if I leave the path revealed by my eyes. Once more, the insistence on the experimentalism is a device to avoid the Catholic censorship, okay? I do not dare to interpretation, okay? In fact, Schiller refuses to deal with the problem of the flood. He just declares that he accepts it. Another situation we have for Thomas Burnet. As a Cambridge latitudinarian of Cambridge, Burnet was persuaded that in Christian thought, the rational investigation was more important than the acceptance of revealed truth. Being deeply influenced by the mechanical hypothesis of Descartes, Burnet thought that science was necessarily meant to prove God's omnipotence and goodness. For the same reasons, he believed that God predisposed and started all the creation, so without any miracle, okay? At the beginning of time, without any subsequent miraculous intervention of the already perfect natural laws. Therefore, he argued that all the water necessary to cover the entire earth during the deluge already existed under the earth crust. The original crust, the original earth for Burnet was a perfect earth, and beautiful in his opinion, as a bowling ball earth, more or less. Moreover, he accepted that God synchronized the time recast by the corruption of humanity, because he was omnipotent, he knew everything, and he knew that man was devoted to corruption. With the time recast by the earth's original smooth crust to dry, crack, and cause the deluge. And therefore the present earth for Burnet is an earth made of ruins. It's a horrible earth made of ruins. And then, in the final conflagration, the earth, all the water will go into the abyss, the crust will crack again, will burn again, and we'll have the final conflagration, the mixing of the water with all the earth crust parts, and the final earth on which Christ, as from the Apocalypse, will reign over for 1,000 years, after which the earth will be transformed in a star, and all the good Anglican souls will go to heaven. William Whiston, he was not Cartesian, he followed Newton, he was a disciple and successor of Newton. Whiston refused the Cartesian earth, adopting the Newtonian model. According to him, the deluge was caused by the collision of the Earth's gravitational field with the gravitational field of a comet, which watery tail submerged the Earth's surface and caused the crust to crack, drawing out the waters from the deep abyss. And it's very significant that Whiston accuses Burnet to this synchronism behavior, because as Newton, Whiston thinks that the deluge was an explicit act of God, an intervention of God. But at the same time, the Mosaic creation is not a nice philosophical account of the origin of all things, but a historical and true representation of the formation of our single earth. Okay, so Whiston claims to be real literally in his interpretation of the Bible, but at the same time, he synchronizes the intervention of God with the corruption of man, as we can see. That omniscient being who foresaw when the degeneracy of human nature would be arrived at an unsufferable degree of wickedness, the iniquities of the world would be completely full, and were consequent in his vengeance how to fall upon them, predisposed and pre-adapted the orbits and motions of both the comet and the earth, so that at the very time, and only at that time, the former should pass close by the latter, and bring the deathful punishment upon them. Okay. The Mosaic creation. Some years later, Whiston, by the way, just for curiosity, identified the comet responsible for the deluge with Halley's comet. This allowed him to provide an extremely accurate calculation of the date of the biblical flood, which was, in his opinion, November 27, 2349 before Christ. Okay. Anyway, both Burnet and Whiston had a critical defect in their treatises. They totally ignored the problem of fossils, and the problem of fossils was a main topic at those time. And this was the main critic that John Woodward made to them. Woodward, a renowned collector of fossils, who was sadly famous too for his academic arrogance, criticized Burnet and Whiston for their negligence in considering the problem of fossils in rock strata. He thought that in order for fossils to get inside the rock layers, the crust must once have been dissolved. Therefore, he claimed that during the deluge, God temporarily and miraculously suspended the gravity force, causing, in his opinion, the dissolution of all the rocks. The remnants of living organisms floated in this sort of fluid mud and eventually dropped more or less quickly according to their density. And in this statement, we find the significant influence of Steno's work, of a Catholic author's work. In the end, when God reactivated the gravity force, the fossils solidified into rock. That was the reason, Woodward argued, for which fossils of the same kind were often found together. In his essay, Toward the Natural History of the Earth. And without any other detail of the different specific gravity of the several bodies in this confused mass, those which had the greatest degree of gravity sinking down first and so setting the lowest, then those bodies which had a lesser degree of gravity fell next and settled so as make a stratum upon the former, and so on in their several turn to the lightest of all. The theory of Woodward was the most famous in Europe, especially in Italy, and probably because he acknowledged a clear, deliberate intervention of God to produce a biblical flood. And this, for Italians too, was a device to, as we'll see, to circumvent Catholic censorship, because we had Italians believing sincerely that the flood existed and the miraculous intervention of God existed, I will see. And other Italians, as for example Ramazzini, Vallisneri, Marsili, that had to recognize the flood, but just in order to make their treatises pass the Catholic censorship, I will see. Anyway, in Europe, Schweitzer, Johann Jakob Schweitzer, was a great admirer of Woodward, a Swiss naturalist and Protestant, and of his system. He edited the Latin translation of Woodward's essay in 1704, and was himself an earnest diluvialist and expert collector of fossils. In 1725, Schweitzer, during one of his field trips in Öningen, on the German side of the Rhine, discovered a fossil that he reputed decisive, the shooting gun, proof of his diluvial theory, since he believed to have found one of the men drowned in the deluge. He baptized it with a significant name of Homo diluvitestis, man witness of the deluge, and published his plate in 1726. Immediately, of course, the new discovery spread through the European Republic of Letters, arousing controversies, enthusiasm, and skepticism as well. Only in 1787, the anatomist Petrus Camper recognized the error, and in 1825, the great Georges Cuvier identified in the Homo diluvitestis the fossil remains of a giant salamander, who in honor of Schweitzer was called Andreas Schweitzeri. Andreas Schweitzeri. And what about the Catholic context? The Catholic view was really complex. In the Catholic countries, and especially in Italy, the censorship was the result of many concurrent factors. We must not commit the error to think that the censorship was univocal, all severe with all the people at the same time, despite that social background, despite that money, despite their power. The personal beliefs of the different censors, their own religious order, Jesuits, Dominicans as well, etc. The rhetorical expedients used by the authors in expressing their ideas, their own social ranking and backgrounds, the social and cultural context in which the different theories were expressed, and last but absolutely not least, the mutable guidelines imposed by the members of Catholic hierarchy and by the different popes. All these factors depict an extremely intricate picture in which, much more than the contrast between dark and light, the dominant shade is the gray that defines the boundary between licit and illegal. And it is exactly on this ambiguous area that we must focus to deepen our knowledge of the Catholic perspective on the theories of the earth. And so we have a contradictory censorship. And just to make an example that I found here at the library, when I asked Bruce Bradley for the first edition of the Telluris Theoria Sacra or Burnett, a book that I remember to you stated that the final conflagration would start from Rome who for the Anglican Burnet was considered the seat of the Antichrist, okay? And not by chance for Burnet, the entire Italy was full of volcanoes, okay? I found on the cover of this book a coat of arms of a Catholic bishop. This Anglican book belonged to a Catholic bishop, and this Catholic bishop was a very controversial, okay, bishop, but was Catholic anyway. Pierre Daniel Huet, Catholic Bishop of Avranches, owner of Burnet's Telluri Theoria Sacra, just to make you know how complex was the situation. Anyway, we had scholars sincerely thinking and sustaining and proving the deluge as a matter of fact. As, for example, Jacopo Grandi, which in his De Veritate Diluvio Universalis, 1676, attempted a naturalistic explanation of the deluge. At the same time, he based his theory on the comparative study of biblical and pagan accounts, which is a common point of both Catholic and Protestant authors, who to try to explain and to show the evidences of past submergences of the earth by consulting Chaldean, Chinese texts and all. Giuseppe Monti, De Monumento Diluviano, 1719. Monti was a proud supporter of Woodward the Schweitzer and gave his contribution to diluvialism by describing some fossils from the Bologna Apennines. He emphasized especially the description of a fossil mammal jaw, which he believed to belong to a walrus. More than a century later, in 1837, naturalist Camillo Ranzani recognized the real origin of this relic, which was the jaw of a rhinoceros. Anyway, once more, and this is another point I wish to express really clearly, we must bear in mind that, especially in the 17th and 18th century, the scientific work of both Catholic and Protestant naturalists was deeply influenced by religious and philosophical factors. Okay? This statement often contradicts the traditional positivist belief of a linear and gradual history of science. Actually, the intellectual context in the 17th century was much, much more eclectic and intricate, and in my opinion, interesting. And should we choose an emblematic author of this contradictory time, our preference would probably definitely favor the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, a German Catholic Jesuit, a powerful, very powerful Jesuit, who was one of the most controversial and contradictory Catholic authors of his time, in which Neoplatonic and Hermetic doctrine coexisted with experimental practice and physical sciences in his work. And a typical consequence, a typical example of this interaction of philosophy, strange philosophy, alchemy too, and experimental research was his most famous work, the Arca Noe, in which Kircher tried to prove the ark could be built by man without any divine intervention, except for the deluge. This was a Jesuit. He calculated the necessary size for the ark to host all the known animals, strictly relying on the information provided by the Genesis. At the same time, other calculations persuaded him that the deluge could not occur by natural causes, since the water of all the oceans was not enough to submerge the entire surface of the earth. Therefore, just for the deluge, he appealed to the explicit act of God. Not nisi supernaturali et omnipotentis Dei miracolosa quadam aquarum multiplicationem pleripote erit. God had to multiply the water of the abysses in order to submerge the earth. And then we have a scholar in Italy who do not believe in the deluge, but cannot assert it clearly. Okay, as Bernardino Ramazzini, which in his De Fontio Mutinesium in 1691 examined the Pliocene and Pleistocene sediment of Italy and found it very difficult to adapt the experimental data they collected to the model of a single global deluge. Like Scilla, he supposed there's a sequence of consecutive flood that happened. Ramazzini, anyway, diminished the importance of the biblical deluge with respect to the geomorphological processes, but had to admit the deluge as a matter of fact. And more we have this kind of research. And as the we had the progression, and we had the progression of the researchers, it became more and more clear that the Bible was facing a chronological outrage. As the debate unleashed by the organic interpretation of fossils, this drew attention of European natural philosophers. It became increasingly clear that the introduction of a chronological dimension within naturalistic studies would impart to scientific subjects a philosophical and metaphysical meaning. Okay, this was clear. But despite the fact that in Europe the discovery of organic remains within mountains layers was early interpreted as a result of the deluge, soon enough, we saw, just in the 16th century, theories emerged of a chronological interpretation with a different time scale from that based on Scripture. In England, we have Edmund Halley in his Some Consideration about the Cause of the Universal Deluge and some further talks about the same subjects. Halley agreed with Whiston about the cause of the deluge, his comet, or the other comets could have encountered the Earth and could have caused other terrible floods in the past, even before the own creation of mankind. And this was a clearly heretical statement. This opposition necessarily implied a heterodox geochronology in clear disagreement with the Bible. Therefore, Halley refused to publish his papers, and not by chance. After the abolition of the license order in England in 1694, he agreed to publish them on the Philosophical Transactions. And once more, we have Hooke, who has the clearest perception of all, probably of all Protestant scholars of the strikingly change in the perception of man's place in nature that the geochronological revolution would occur and would bring. It must be granted that it's very difficult to read them, the fossils, to raise a chronology out of them, and to state the intervals of the times wherein such or such catastrophes and mutation have happened. Yet this is not impossible, but that by the help of those joined to other means and assistances of information, much may be done, even in the part of information also. And once more, he clearly declares, it seems to me very improbable that these shells should have been the effect of Noah's flood by reason of its short duration, which was not long enough in continuance to produce and perfect those creatures, not enough to produce the rock strata, the rock layers. And in this statement too, we find a great influence, as Hooke acknowledges, of Steno and of his studies of the rock strata and rock layers. In so short a space to the bigness and perfection they seem to have had. And in Italy we have antediluvialist people, as Luigi Ferdinando Marsili, who, like Schiller, Hooke, Vallisneri, and Dion Fracastoro, he believed the biblical deluge unable to explain the present and arrangement of fossils and rock strata. In his breve ristretto del saggio fisico intorno alla storia del mare, he described the geological structures of the coast of Provence and the southern part of Mediterranean France. And he outlined a model of sedimentary process which clearly diverged from the diluvial theories proposed by Woodward, Schweitzer, Whiston, and Burnett. And then we have probably the most antediluvialist of all Catholic naturalists, which was Antonio Vallisneri. The main lines of Vallisneri's thought about the origin of the earth were expressed in his chief natural history text, the De Corpi Marini che su monti si trovano, on the marine bodies which are found on the mountains in 1721. The analysis of both the De Corpi Marini and the letters has allowed to understand many apparent inconsistencies that we can find in this work. Why? Vallisneri was extremely clear with his correspondence, especially with the European correspondence. He denied the biblical deluge. As we can find this letter to Louis Bourget, another great naturalist who was a diluvialist. He said, "My beloved Mr. Lewis, the earth is far older than is believed. Rivers shift, old mountains go down and new ones arise. There are seas and valleys now where dry land once was, or land and fields where once were water and seas. Earthquakes, volcanoes, the rains, sometimes immense, the sea storms, the wind force, and other can cause the strangest changes." This is quite the same theory proposed by Hooke in a Catholic context. And what if the sea that surrounds Italy would once have been high up to the mountains? Unless the faith that we owe to the holy text, who assures us of the deluge, the Chinese question it. And so do a lot of evidences that now I have no time to show. But anyway, even there is a difference anyway between the correspondence between Vallisneri and his Protestant correspondents and Vallisneri and other Italians, very confident Italians that wouldn't be related with the censorship. When, these are very funny, speaking about Bourget, so the interlocutor of the previous letter, with his friend, a Catholic, Jacopo Riccati, he makes a statement who declares clearly the different perception of Catholic others toward the biblical deluge and the biblical interpretation. Mr. Bourget, as all the heretics, has a real passion for the Holy Scripture. I laugh at those ones who always try to explain natural phenomena appealing to the Bible. Those who really want to be natural philosophers must give up all the prejudices and the old books. Rather, they must read the book of nature, which is just like the Bible is the book of God. The concept of book of nature is a typical Galilean concept, okay? And just like the Bible is unfailing and immutable, with this only, but not only, in my opinion, difference, not so small difference. The former is written in the clearest language, while the latter contains sacred mysteries. Well, this for the private communication, but then there was the public communication, the treatises, and in the treatises, Vallisneri couldn't afford to state in such a clear way his opinions. And so he was forced to say in the De Corpi Marini, "My Lord, we cannot understand completely what we can daily see and touch with our hands, but we wish to know such a portentous prodigy, and we try to explain it, despite nature, with the same laws of nature, as some experience it, but narrow-minded people claim to do." The narrow-minded people was Woodward, Burnett, Weston for Vallisneri. Because in this quote, the deluge occurred, God punished the treachery and ingratitude of human beings. But I cannot understand how this took place if I do not resort to his unpredictable will and to his endless omnipotence. Deluge, for a Catholic who does not believe in the deluge, is a miracle. He tells the church, yes, it is a miracle, and I cannot absolutely understand it. But the learned reader, which in many cases is against the deluge, understand the real message in the lines of these phrases, which is, just don't consider the deluge. The deluge is a miracle, is a fable. Just consider the real book of nature. Just base your opinions on the experimentalism, on the field research. This was a very typical sort of auto censorship and a rhetorical device was used by many Catholic authors to confront it, to cheat the Catholic censorship. But by Vallisneri, it's brought at its maximum and its most refined way, in my opinion. In fact, in Vallisneri, in his De Corpi Marini, tried to mix this declaration in which he bowed to the church with a bunch, with a real extremely big quantity of experimental data that clearly contradicted the existence of the deluge. And so we have this other very funny letter to Louis Bourget in which is stated, when we resort to miracles, natural history provides everything. I indeed often use them in my treatises, the De Corpi Marini. But do you know why? To make the priests be silent. Otherwise, I imply that the events I speak of did not happen, as Woodward and many scholars would imagine. And in another letter on Antonio Conti in 1721, he regrets for it's too late to know of a laziest animal from America, which is so slow that it takes an entire day to walk 50 steps. So in order to reach Noah's Ark from America, it would have taken about 6,000 years. If I knew this beautiful information before, I would have added in my treatises on the deluge to confuse even further the Father Kirchen and all the long-bearded philosophers. And the same self-censorship strategy can be found in the work of another Italian, the abbot, a priest, Anton Lazzaro Moro, in his De Crostacei in 1740, which was a substantially antediluvialist treatise in which he assumed that the mountains were raised by subterraneous fires. And it's really significant that a priest, dare to assert what Vallisneri only suggests, being him timorous of potential censorship measures, and not by chance. At those time when More published his book, the Pope was Benedict XIV, a learned, tolerant, and enlightened man who mitigated the own Index Librorum Prohibitorum with a special protection for culture and science. As a conclusion, self-censorship and communication problems. The reception of many Catholic are those theories, just for the problems I told you before, in the Protestant countries was seriously damaged and limited by the self-censorship strategies and by the expressive ambiguity that they had to use in order to cheat the ecclesiastical inquisition. The Homme Bourget, who was one of Vallisneri's closest international correspondents, didn't fully understand the implied chronological message of the De Corpi Marini. And it is the Lettre philosophique in 1729 and simply associated Vallisneri with Palissy, Fracastoro, Leibniz, Schiller, Colonna, and all the others supporting the theory sur les séjours naturels des lacs de Salé or de la mer dans les lieux à le trouver des coquillages. Moreover, Italy had another big problem, the institutional problem, which was a consequence of the separation among the various states that was caused essentially by the Church. And a lack of institution as the Académie Royale de France in France instead, the Royal Society in England. Yes, we had academies in Italy, Accademia del Cimento, Accademia dei Lincei, but they were not protected. They were not secularly protected by the ingerence of the Church. Okay, and from here we have a very weak interpretative science in Italy, because it was subjected to the condemnation and to the control of the censorship. Anyway, despite the frequent theoretical misunderstanding between Catholic and Protestant interpretative systems, it is undeniable that the strong Italian experimental tradition exerted a great influence on the earth sciences in Europe. The experimental works performed by Stino, Vallisneri, Schiller, Ramazzini, Marsili, and many others gave a significant contribution and provided an enormous quantity of experimental data to the Republic of Letters, and played a crucial role into the development of the earth sciences in countries, as England, for instance, where experimental research and theoretical interpretation could peacefully, or anyway, more quietly interact. And as a consequence of time extensions, I found that especially in Hooke for the Protestant countries and Vallisneri for the Catholic countries, we can find the clearest perception of the disruptive effect caused by the chronological factor. A time scale of 1 million, and that from the subsequent discoveries, billion years not only changed the idea of creation and of man's role in it, but it also affected the own scientific concepts of experimental verification and experimental observation. This is a problem which still today is very, very, very big. Just consider all the debate about evolutionism, okay? Therefore, it implied a true epistemological revolution. And it is not exaggerated to assert that this own revolution opened the way to a dynamic concept of nature that set the basis for a new scientific attitude, which culminated centuries later with Darwin's theory of evolution. And in the end, I just ask for your patience for just 20 seconds to thank with all my heart Bill Ashworth, Bruce Bradley, Nancy Green, Tanya Kelly, Nancy Officer, Scott Ritter, Cindy Rogers, Donna Swisher, Eric Ward, rigorously in alphabetical order. And to all the friends of the Lena Hall Library for their competence, their kindness, and above all for their sincere friendship. Thank you very much.
Given the context of the current time and debate that goes on amongst the current population, mostly what you were discussing were the learned people of the time. Well, what was the common citizen believing? What was their attitudes about all of this? How much of this was being debated amongst them? What was their ability to be communicated with?
Very very interesting question, because until some decades ago, there was scholars stating that the men of the street thought that all fossils were just jokes of nature, or just proofs put by God in order to prove the belief in a few thousand years age-old Earth. But as many studies, especially in the Catholic countries, show, yet in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, we have people off the street stating that this fossil had organic origins. So it's not true that this was an opinion confined just to the learned circuits of the academies of the learned people. Okay, even if it depended, of course, on the countries. As I told before, a situation was in Italy where they have a particular kind of fossils. Another situation was in England, for instance, where they have 65, 17, 80 million years old fossils where did not resemble very well the present day organisms. And so it was very probable that many, let's make this term, people of the street should acknowledge with the origin, with the magical or alchemic origin of strange origin of these fossils. If I well understood your question, was I able to? Okay. Switch off. Okay. Okay.
I'm wondering if the Italian tradition of great skill in artistic production, of verisimilitude, of intensely looking at the natural world, that we see in all the drafts of all the different kinds of sketches of these fossils, is in part of what you see as what is the experimental model, and that they're looking very carefully and recording in the data that they're seeing, and that becomes part of it. I've been doing some reading about Caravaggio and some of the, that era when Giordano Bruni was executed, and the terror of even the artists of trying to depict things, but also the emphasis of the Catholic Church in the post-Reformation of the physical body as a way of counteracting the abstraction of the Protestant Church. And so it seems to me, though, abstraction is not all that is helpful if you're trying to collect data about what things look like. So I'm just wondering if you could address that. I've been thinking about this for a lot, so I'm really interested in what you have to say about this.
Because I had no time. I already had, I went over my time. I beg your pardon for this. But one of my intentions was to state the real importance of the anatomical studies on the discovery of the perception between form and function. Okay? And from the growing perception of the organic origin of bodies. So the early Renaissance tradition of art, we can quietly quote Caravaggio and before the own Michelangelo, Leonardo above all, is very significant and very important in contributing to the growing perception of the existing relationship between form and function. And from this, deducing from these fossils, the organic origin, okay? I should have.
I think this kind of tags onto your question. I didn't start paying attention to this until you actually started. You were a little bit into your talk, but it seemed to me that the earlier treatises were written in Latin, and that the farther we get into the 17th century and then the 18th century, they're written in the vernacular. And so that if you were in England in 1715, whatever, and you could read, which a lot of people could, you could read it. You didn't have to be able to read Latin. It was also true that some of them were written in Italian as opposed to in Latin. And I think that as this must have then influenced not just the great intelligentsia and the priests and the very educated class, but a much wider group of people. Now, that doesn't mean that, Joe Blow or the equivalent would have thought that, but I think that it was just interesting. I'll be interested to see when the books that are displayed.
In the spreading of the theories, language has a key role, of course. And not by chance, Scheutzen in 1704 translated in Latin Woodward essay. Okay. Anyway, until the half, we can definitely state that until the half of the 18th century, from the scientific point of view, okay, Latin was the common language. And so Latin and French. And so it was very typical in Italy or in Germany, for example, to find people knowing well French and Latin. And this was a sort of device that could allow people to, and theories to spread. And from this point of view, it's another very important point that, if I may, I must suggest, is that when in the end of my presentation I talk about the institutional lack of protection about science in Italy, the own language is a very important part of this institutional protection. Not by chance, Valesneri devoted many efforts to encourage Italian scientists to publish in Italian, as the French did in France, and the English did in English in England. But he wasn't able to achieve this aim because it was a very fragmented, politically and culturally, still today is a fragmented country. And so the language is another key role in order to understand the spread of scientific theories in 17th and 18th century Europe. Thank you too.